Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to KRS TV. This is your boy Kenny, and this is a new episode of my new show, Tea and Scandals. I'd like to thank all of you for clicking on. And this episode is about one of the greatest male groups of all time, and that is none other than the Temptations. Known for their distinct choreography, beautiful harmonies, and dress style, they are probably one of the best acts of all time, and they have paved the way for many acts that followed after them. For example, New Edition, High Five. So many, artists have benefited from the great blueprint that the Temptations have set forth. And the Temptations were a combination of two local groups in Detroit, one being the Primes, which consisted of Eddie Kendricks and Paul Williams, and Otis Williams in the Distance, which consisted of Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, and then L. Albridge Bryant, before the arrival of David Ruffin. So let's tap into this. Now, the group The Primes, which consisted of Eddie Kendricks and Paul Williams, both of them were from Birmingham, Alabama. They started a quintet in 1955 called the Cavaliers. They had settled in Cleveland. The other two members were Kel Osborne and Willie Waller. While in Cleveland, I think that's when Waller left the group, and they then went to Detroit, where they settled under the management of Milton Jenkins, and they became the Primes in 1957. And the Primes also, became a very big act in Detroit. And Jenkins, because of their local success, created a sister group called the Primettes, which would later become the Supremes. Now, on the other side of Detroit, you had Otis Williams, who was born in Texas but was raised in Detroit with his mother and stepfather. He formed the group Otis Williams and the Siberians, which consisted of Elbridge Al Bryant, James Pee Wee Crawford, Bernard Plain, and Arthur Walton. And they had a local song that they released called Pico's Kid. Later on, they changed their name to the El Domingos, and this is when Melvin Franklin came in. He replaced Arthur Walton, and Richard Street replaced their lead singer Bernard Plain. And then at this time they began to be managed by Johnny Mae Matthews, who was the head of Northern Records, and she christened them Otis Williams in the Distance. And in 1959 they released a local hit called Come On, and Richard Street was the lead singer on this song. Even though the song was a local hit, they got no money from it as far as record sales. And they got out of their Northern Records contract, but they could no longer use their name Otis Williams in the Distance. And around this time, Albert Mooch Harrell had replaced Pee Wee Crawford. He had so pretty much after Albert Mooch Harrell had replaced Pee Wee Crawford. And after they left Northern Records, Albert Mooch Harrell left the group along with Richard Street. So the Primes disbanded and then around the same time, the Primes had disbanded after Kel Osborne moved to California. This pretty much made Eddie Kendricks as well as Paul Williams to move back to Alabama. And while Eddie Kendricks was in Detroit visiting family, he had called Otis and talked about an idea of them combining their groups together because around the time they left Northern Records, Otis Williams had met Berry Gordy, and Berry Gordy had offered them an audition. And here it is, they had the audition, but he didn't have a group because he had lost two members, and both Paul and Eddie were in the bind because they lost a member, and the Primes had disbanded. So they pretty much in this conversation, you know, the Primes decided to combine with Otis Williams in the Distance, and they became the Elgins. And in March of 1961, they auditioned for Motown. But Barry immediately told them that they had to change their name, so they all came together and created and pretty much came up with a new name, which was the Temptations. And Paul Williams actually sung on the first two singles, you know, once they were signed to Motown. One was Oh Mother of Mine and Check Yourself. But their first charted single was the song You're My Dream Come True, which reached number 22 on the R&B charts, and the lead was done by Eddie Kendricks. And it's a beautiful song. I've listened to it. It's really nice. And it was around this time that, you know, between 61 and 63, they were on the Motown Review Tour, and around this time they had many releases, but none of them were hits, you know, and they began to be known around Motown as the Hitless Temptations. And also around this time, they was also paired with Smokey Robinson as their producer. He did the song I Want a Love I Can See, which had Paul Williams as the lead. Even though it was a beautiful song, and even though Paul Williams kills the vocals on this song, it didn't make it on the charts. So here we are within the 1961 to 63, you know, range of the history of the Temptations. Around this time, I'm going to bring in David Ruffin. Now, David Ruffin, whose great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran, you know, was born in Wyandotte, Mississippi. Marvin Gaye has said of him that I heard a strength in his voice, a strength my own voice lacked. Now, that's coming from Marvin Gaye himself. So David Ruffin was definitely a phenomenal talent. And you know, in the 1940s, he was a part of his family gospel group that opened for Mahalia Jackson and the Five Blind Boys of Alabama. At 14, he left home and went to Memphis, Tennessee, to pursue ministry under the guardianship of Minister Eddie Bush. At 15, he began to travel, you know, with acts like Frankie Lyman, the Staple Singers, Elvis Presley, you know, Bobby Womack. By the age of 16, he had moved in Detroit, and he had met Berry Gordy in 1957. Now, David Ruffin will pretty much said in a documentary that he literally helped build Motown with his hands, because while he met Berry Gordy, he started to live with Berry's parents. Berry's father was a contractor, and he was the one who actually helped reconstruct the house that became Hitsville, USA. And David Ruffin, you know, did work with his father on reconstructing the Hitsville house. So we can say that yes, definitely, David Ruffin was a part of history in a big way. While he was, you know, during this, you know, time in 1958, he released two solo records, You and I and Believe Me, on Vega Records, and he did it under the name Little David Bush. Later on, he ended up joining Anna Records, which was the precursor for, you know, Motown Records. And Anna Records, their biggest hit was the song by Barry Strong, Money, That's What I Want, which was known as Motown's first big hit. And then also, you know, this is around the time he, you know, began to collaborate, you know, he began to work with Marvin Gaye. You know, him and Marvin Gaye used to stack boxes at Anna Records, and they also were session musicians and roadies. So they worked along, so pretty much they both came to Motown around the same time, and they were both very active, you know, as far as session musicians, as far as, you know, doing, you know, any work that was needed. And on this label, Anna Records, which was actually run by Berry Gordy's sister, Gwen Gordy Fuqua, David was actually, you know, not only signed as a musician, but also as an artist. But, you know, his recordings had no hits, and Marvin Gaye was signed as a drummer for the label. David Ruffin, you know, also around this time befriends the Temptations. You know, he pretty much works with them in any way he can. He even started out as a drummer for the Temptations as well. You know, so David was ready for anything, and he even shared with Otis Williams that he wanted to be a part of the group. But at the time, Eldridge Al Bryant was in the group, and they already had 5 members. So David was ready, you know, for anything, and he was always there, you know, as an aide to help them out, and also to lend his voice whenever they needed him. So here it is from 61 to 63, this 2-year gap, you know, they have not had any hits. Elbridge Al Bryant started to become very restless. He became very argumentative and even volatile, you know, due to his frustration with the group, and due to the fact that he was the only one that still had his job as a milkman, and he didn't want to let his job go because he really didn't fully believe in the group. And it got to a point where there was a event where him and Paul Williams got into a fight, and he actually cracked a bottle over Paul Williams' head, and he had to be hospitalized. But things came ahead, even so, in January of pretty much at the end of 1963, when they were performing at a New Year's Eve party, there was another, you know, altercation on stage, and that's when Otis Williams put his foot down, and he pretty much kicked Elbridge Bryant out the group, and pretty much you know, David Ruffin became the new member of the Temptations. And sadly, Elbridge Bryant went on, you know, to pursue other music endeavors, but he also battled alcoholism, and he ended up dying at the age of 36 in 1975 due to cirrhosis of the liver. So by, you know, January 1964, you know, David Ruffin is now a member of the Temptations. Their first big hit was "The Way You Do the Things You Do" with Eddie Kendricks singing lead. It goes number 11 on the pop and number 1 on the R&B charts. You know, this followed with other songs, "Girl, Why You Wanna Make Me Blue," which went on the pop charts at number 26. "I'll Be in Trouble," which went number 33 on the pop charts. Another song, which definitely is also one of my favorites, "The Girl's All Right With Me." It didn't reach the top 100 on the pop charts. It went to 102, but it was a top 40 R&B hit. It went at number 39. And at this time, you know, these are all songs that were composed by Smokey Robinson. Smokey was itching to record a song on David because David had that distinct voice where you would kind of compare David Ruffin's voice to like a preacher. It's like when he was singing, it was like he was giving a sermon, and you literally paid attention to hear what David Ruffin had to say as far as his vocal delivery. And I definitely saw that was his unique ability that I didn't see with Eddie and Paul, even though they both were phenomenal talents in their own right, because those three were like the lead singers of the group. So it was during their Motortown tour in the fall of '64 where Smokey Robinson actually penned the song "My Girl," which is today a timeless track. It is still relevant today as it was then in 1964, and this song has become their signature song. They can't do any show without doing "My Girl," and "My Girl" went number 1 pop, number 1 R&B. It went I think it went number 43 on the UK charts and number 8 on the Canadian charts. So it was a very big hit, and this song was a game changer for the Temptations. You know, now they have literally topped the pop charts. And you know, even Norman Whitfield even said that when he delivered the track to Mr. Gordy after Smokey was finished, he's like, I was kind of like a servant, like, "Here, Mr. Gordy, take this," because he says that I just couldn't believe that that there was a record that good, and Smokey blew it out the water, because that completely changed, you know, the career for the Temptations from that point on. They also had, more pop hits. Um, Since I Lost My Baby went to number 17 on the pop charts, number 4 on the R&B charts. Baby went to number 13 pop, and number 4 on the R&B charts. Now, Get Ready, Norman Whitfield was aching to get into to write and produce for the Temptations. So he told Berry Gordy, that, I wanna do a song on the Temptations. Well, Berry Gordy told Norman Whitfield that, hey, if this song doesn't get into the top 20, I'll give you a shot on the Temptations. So when Get Ready was released, even though it was a big R&B hit, it went number 1 R&B, but it didn't get top 20 on the pop charts. It hit number 29. So Norman Whitfield got his chance, to do a song on them. And Norman Whitfield said that his challenge was to take them away from the ballad-based, sound that they had with Smokey Robinson, and give them more of a harder, edgier, soul and funk that we were getting from James Brown. He wanted to do that with the Temptations. So the first song that Norman Whitfield did with the Temptations was Ain't Too Proud to Beg, which was a big hit because it went number 13 on the pop charts and number 1 on the R&B charts. And from that point on, Norman Whitfield was the new producer and writer for the Temptations. Another hit that was written was Beauty Is Only Skin Deep. It went number 3 pop and number 1 R&B. I Know I'm Losing You went to number 8 pop and number 1 R&B. So the Temptations are killing it as far as the pop charts and the R&B charts. I mean, they are literally punching hits one after the other. Loneliness Made Me Realize It's You That I Need. That went to number 14 on the pop charts and number 3 on the R&B charts. And on that song, each member had sang lead throughout the song. So that that was the only song that all of them sang lead, and it actually crossed over to the pop charts as well. All I Need went to number 8 pop and number 2 R&B. You're My Everything, one of my faves, went number 6 pop and went number 3 R&B. And I Wish It Would Rain, actually one of the producers of the song, I think his name was Roger Benzine, he actually had committed suicide, I think, a week before it was released. So if someone had a posthumous, connection to him. But this song was also a big hit. It went number 4 pop and number 1 R&B. So they're killing, they're really killing the game right now. In this time, between like 64 to 68, they at one point were the hitless Temptations, and now they got one hit after the other. They're now getting they now are getting a lot of mainstream, bookings like American Bandstand, the Ed Sullivan Show, and the Hollywood Palace. And in 1967, they got under the management of Shelley Berger, and they started to do this new pop album to try to get more of the mainstream white audience. So it was a album with standards, and it was called The Temptations and the Mellow Mood. And this also opened doors for them to get to the Copacabana. At the time was a very segregated, nightclub in New York, but if you played Copa, you could play anywhere. So that was like one of the pinnacles. So it was around towards the middle and end of 1967 that they started to have problems with David Ruffin. David Ruffin really started developing a really bad drug addiction. He started missing performances, rehearsals, and group meetings. When they would go to events, he would have his, fur interior limousine. Him and Tammy Terrell were riding his limousine, and he wouldn't ride in the same car with the other Temptations. So there was already this divide that was already starting to happen within the group. But David kind of joked and said that, hey, they could have ride with me if they wanted to. But the last straw came when they had a gig in at a Cleveland supper club, and instead of him going to the gig, he decided to go to the show of his girlfriend, Barbara Gall Martin, who is the daughter of Dean Martin, When he pulled that stunt, that's when they decided enough is enough. And on June 27, 1968, David Ruffin was fired from the group. And the next day, Dennis Edwards from the, originally from the Contours, replaced Ruffin. And the funny thing about it, David Ruffin and Dennis Edwards were actually good friends. And actually, Ruffin called Edwards and let him know, they're going to ask you to replace me. Go ahead and take it. You're good. You're going to do great. And they had this very good camaraderie with each other. But when it came down to them doing the stage performances, there were times where David Ruffin would take the mic from Dennis Edwards and would sing lead on the songs that he had sung lead on, like Since I Lost My Baby or Ain't Too Proud to Beg. And he did this repeatedly throughout the 1968 tour, and this definitely pissed off Otis. But they decided that, okay, we'll give him an opportunity, because there was a big crowd, a big demand from the audience to see David Ruffin. David Ruffin was beloved. So they decided, okay, we'll give you an opportunity and what the opportunity was is that at Gaithersburg, Maryland, if he showed up at this performance, they would pretty much lay off Dennis Edwards and let David Ruffin come back for a trial run. But once he missed that, they was like, okay, that's over and done with, we're moving on. And Ruffin no longer interrupted their performances, after that. But David, was one of the first members of the Temptations who began to share his dissatisfaction with Motown and their contract, and that they wanted to know, their business and their accounting. And pretty much David ends up suing Motown, and Motown ends up settling it out of court, and as a part of it, David is signed as a solo artist on Motown. Now with Dennis Edwards at the helm, the Temptations become bigger than ever as far as their television appearances, and also some of their top bookings that they're having all across the country. In 1968, they do the album Live at the Copa, and also within 68, they started to do a lot of collaborations with Diana Ross and the Supremes. They actually did an album, Diana Ross and the Supremes Joined the Temptations, which peaked at number 2 on the pop charts, and one of their biggest hits off that album is I'm Gonna Make You Love Me. And they not only went on tour with Diana Ross and the Supremes, but then they also did 2 television specials and I've seen them both. TCB, Taking Care of Business, which premiered in December of 1968, and GIT, Getting It Together on Broadway, which premiered in November of 69. And I can honestly say, on TCB, when Paul Williams performed for Once in My Life, I literally was moved to tears. I mean, Paul Williams has so much soul, and the way he sings that song, you knew he meant it. And his whole, who he was, like, really came out in that song. And you really saw how much that Paul Williams was the actual heart of the Temptations. Not only was he one of the best singers, but then he was also a great choreographer. So what you saw on stage as far as, their movement and their syncopation, that was Paul Williams, along with Charlie Atkins, because Charlie Atkins was the choreographer of Motown. Him and Paul were butt heads, but the good thing about it is that Paul was the energy that really created, the Temptations, presentation on stage, because Paul Williams said that, we're going to dance and we're going to sell sex. And sell sex they did. Towards the early 1970s, the psychedelic-based music was really taking wave, which became very popular with Sly and the Family Stone and many other artists at that time. And this is the sound that Norman Whitfield introduced to the Temptations. And they had a big hit with the song Cloud 9, which went number 6 pop and number 2 R&B, and it also won them their first Grammy as Best R&B vocal performance by a group. And from 1969 to 1970, They had the song "Runaway Child," "Running Wild," which went number 6 pop and number 1 R&B. "I Can't Get Next to You," definitely one of my favorite songs right there, went number 1 pop and number 1 R&B. And "Psychedelic Shack," which went number 7 pop and number 2 R&B. And also "Ball of Confusion," which also another one of my favorite songs. "That's What the World Is Today." It went number 3 pop and number 2 R&B. And it was around 1970 and 71 where things started to break down with the Temptations. One being Paul Williams. He suffered from sickle cell anemia. He also started to battle depression, due to issues in his personal life, and also being on the road a lot. And being on the road definitely took a toll on him, because around this time he started becoming he was a full-fledged alcoholic, where at one point all he would drink was milk. Now he's drinking alcohol and passing out. They had to have oxygen tanks backstage, because after a performance he would pass out. And it was 1969 where Richard Street, who was now a part of this Motown group, the Monitors, when Paul Williams couldn't actually perform well on stage due to him being drunk, Richard Street was actually set up backstage behind a curtain singing Paul's parts. And due to Paul's health, in 1971, he ended up leaving the Temptations because he could no longer perform due to his health issues. And Richard Street was later put on to... At first, Richard Street was only there to replace him on tour when he couldn't perform. But then once he left the group, Richard Street was brought on as his permanent replacement. And it was also around this time in 71 where, Eddie Kendricks began to have issues with Otis Williams and Melvin over the direction of the group. Because originally it was Eddie and Otis who together brought together the actual Temptations. But it started to get to the point where Otis was making more of the decisions, and he was kind of having a hierarchy, more of a hierarchy over the group, which really did not sit well with Eddie. And there were a lot of verbal and physical battles in regards to this, mainly due to the fact that Eddie was beginning very dissatisfied with the money they were receiving from Motown. They felt that they weren't getting a good portion of their royalties, and also for what they were bringing to the table. So his idea was that they should go on strike. Performances, no more recordings, no nothing. But Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin were dead set against that, which did nothing but fuel more fire to the flame. That at a performance at the Copacabana, Kendricks banged on Otis Williams' door, and Otis didn't open the door because he said, "If I open that door, we're gonna fight." And he said from that point on, afterwards, after Eddie kept banging, Eddie eventually left, and that was his last time performing as a Temptation. So, but before him and Paul left the group, they did record the song "It Was Just My Imagination." Definitely one of my favorite tracks from the Temptations. That also went number 1 pop and number 1 R&B. Eddie Kendricks pretty much got a solo deal with Motown. He was originally replaced by Ricky Owens from the group Vibrations, but he was fired because he didn't know the words to the songs. He ended up returning, back to his group, the Vibrations, and he ended up passing away in 1996. Then Damon Harris replaced him in 1971, and Damon Harris had a very good high tenor. So here was the Temptations was still thriving. With Richard Street and Damon Harris now a part of the Temptations, they did the song "Papa Was a Rolling Stone," which was a smash, for the Temptations. It went number 1 pop and number 5 R&B, and it won 3 Grammys. It won the Temptations' second Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance, and it won for Best R&B Instrumental and Best R&B Song, which Best R&B Song, Norman Whitfield shared that with Barrett Strong, the original artist of Motown, who is now a writer and producer working with Norman now. And also Norman won for Best R&B Instrumental as well. So they have now become like a force, within the music industry and also within the pop arena. So, following that success, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, and that's definitely another signature track that if the Temptations perform, they got to do Papa Was a Rolling Stone. I mean, that bass, that bass entering the first part of the song is just synonymous. I mean, I hear it right now just talking about it. In 1973, they had another hit with the song Masterpiece, which entered number 7 pop, number 1 best-selling soul single. But on August 17th, 1973, tragedy struck where Paul Williams was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his car in a vacant parking lot. He was only 34 years old. And this was a tremendous and tragic loss, not only for the music world, but for the brothers that he came up with in the music business, his fellow members of the Temptations, especially his best friend since childhood, Eddie Kendricks. But around this time in 73, they started to have issues with Norman Whitfield because they felt he was too cocky, he wasn't really paying attention to their sound, and it was like he was giving more fair treatment to other artists than he was to them, and it started to become a problem. So eventually, Norman Whitfield left Motown, and later on, probably like mid to late 1973, and he established his own label, Whitfield Records, in 1975. And one of the noted acts that he had on this label was Rolls Royce. And in 1975, the Temptations are still having a dry spell. Around 75, Damon Harris was fired. Glenn Leonard was his replacement. They released 3 albums, House Party, Wings of Love, and The Temptations Do the Temptations, where there were no commercial success, there were no hits on the charts. And they were also kind of like working with different producers. And one of the producers wanted to put more of Dennis Edwards in the front and wanted to make the other members background singers. And definitely Otis was against that. So by 76, Dennis Edwards was fired, from the group, and he was replaced by Louis Price. They end up leaving Motown in 1976 and end up going to Atlantic Records. And in Atlantic Records, they released 2 albums, Here to Tempt You in 77 and Bareback in 1978, which they also had no success there either, and they were released in 1979, and they reassigned with Motown in 1980. And also, Dennis Edwards came back to the group once they re-signed with Motown. And they had a minor hit with this song, Power, that was written and that was co-wrote and produced by Berry Gordy. It went number 11 on the R&B charts, but didn't hit the top 40. So pretty much they were there, for 2 years, with underperforming singles and albums. There were no big hits. And then 1982 is when the idea of the reunion tour came about. Now, both David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks had solo success after leaving the Temptations. David, after leaving the Temptations, had a big hit with the song My Whole World Ended in 1969. My Whole World Ended the Moment You Left Me. It went number 9 on the pop charts and went number 2 on the R&B charts. And he didn't have another big hit until 1975 with Walk Away From Love. And let me tell you, I love David Ruffin's voice on this song. It makes me emotional when I hear this song, because I'm just like, man, this guy's voice is just, it's a gift from God, because this man's vocal ability was just insane. But This song was actually produced by Van McCoy, famous producer and creator of the song, Do the Hustle. And this song went number 9 pop, and it went number 1 on the R&B charts, which was his biggest, biggest hit out of his career. And due to his issues with drugs, bad management, lack of support from his label, he ended up leaving Motown in 1977. And also, which was probably added to his demise, was also issues in his personal life. He was married twice. His first marriage was to Sarah Barnes, where he had 3 daughters. And then he had a long-term relationship that lasted about 10 years with Jenna Sapia, who was a long-time girlfriend who he had his son, David Ruffin Jr. with. And the funny thing about it, it was during their relationship, and she said that David would come and go without a moment's notice. And it was while he was dating Jenna Sapia that he began his turbulent relationship with Tammy Terrell, which ended in 1967 after he hit her in the head with a bicycle helmet. And sadly, this abusive behavior he also took out on Jenna Sapia and also his son. And he also, she finally left him in 1974, and in 75 he married Joy Hamilton. So pretty much by 1982, David Ruffin was in a very bad space, and him going on tour definitely was something that he needed. But not only him, Eddie Kendricks was in the same spot, because after Eddie Kendricks left the Temptations and he became a solo artist, he had a big hit, and I think it was somewhat a redemption for Eddie, because in 1971 the Temptations released a song that was created by Norman Whitfield called Superstar, Remember How You Got Where You Are, which was like a diss song against David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks, who were no longer a part of the Temptations. So, and the song actually went, number 18 on the pop charts. So, they both pretty much kind of felt that, the Temptations was coming for them, because, they left the group and they became solo artists in their own right. But 2 years later, Eddie Kendricks released Keep On Truckin', which is a massive hit. And I would have to say he had the biggest hit out of all of the Temptations that went solo, because Keep On Truckin' went number 1 pop, and went number 1 R&B, and went number 18th on the UK charts, which was a very big hit. And then he also had hits with Boogie Down, which went number 2 pop, and also Shoeshine Boy, which went number 18 pop. And then one of his songs, Intimate Friends, was also sampled by Alicia Keys for the song Unbreakable. This song was also sampled by Common, Sparkle, and Erykah Badu. He ended up leaving Motown in 1978 and ended up signing with Arista and Arista Records in Atlantic. So by the time 1982, he was in a dry spell as well as David Ruffin. So them doing the reunion tour was big business at that time. So they all got together to do this reunion tour. Dennis Edwards, along with Richard Street and many, and they were all included. So it was now 9 Temptations altogether. And they actually had a big hit with Rick James called Standing on the Top. I remember that song when that song came out. It went number 6 R&B, and it went number 66 pop. And you can definitely tell on this song that Kendrick sounded great, but he wasn't able to hit the higher notes that he used to due to his chain smoking, and later he was diagnosed with lung cancer. So in 1985, both David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks actually performed with Hall & Oates on their Live at the Apollo album, and they also were big influences, and they definitely became good friends with Ruffin and Kendricks, and Ruffin ended up becoming a duo, Ruffin and Kendrick, where Kendrick's the S was dropped off his name, and they actually signed with RCA in 1988. So by the time 1989, when they were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Ruffin and Kendrick are a duo, and they've been doing a lot of performing. And it was a great to that, you know, this group finally got the recognition that they deserve by being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because they really did change the game of pop and R&B music. And it was there that both Kendrick and Ruffin recruited Dennis Edwards to form a trio. And they actually did have a good run. They even had a very successful European tour. But, and then they were even offered even more money to go back on tour. I think they were offered, $150,000 advance for each of them. But by 1991, David Ruffin had died from a drug overdose on June 1st, 1991, in a hospital in Philadelphia. And also, it was the same year, 1991, where Eddie Kendricks was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he later on passed on October 5th, 1992, at the age of 52. The Temptations, on the other hand, did have another hit in 1984 with "Treat Her Like a Lady." Yeah, I definitely remember that playing on the radio when I was a little boy. And they continued to perform, and Melvin Franklin, who definitely was the sole base of the Temptations and one of the signature voices, he actually passed away on February 23rd, 1995, following a series of seizures, going as back as early February. And his mother, Rose Franklin, who was kind of known as Mama Rose, she was the mother to the group. She fed them. They would sometimes, stay at her house. And, and Otis's mom was another AIDS. She was also another, another mother figure for the group. But Melvin Franklin's mom, Rose, she had passed away in March of 2013. Dennis Edwards, had some solo success in 1984 with the song "Don't Look Any Further," which was a duet that he did with Sadea Garrett. It went number 2 on the R&B charts, and he actually passed away February 1st, 2018, after suffering from meningitis. So, the Temptations are still performing, and Otis Williams, being the only original member of the Temptations, is still heading the pack. And currently, the Temptations that he sings with now are Ron Tyson, Terry Weeks, Larry Braggs, and Willie Green. And they recently, I think, if I'm not mistaken, are doing a tour with the Four Tops. So they're still out here doing great things, and they still are a force to be reckoned with. And Otis Williams, even in his age, is still keeping up with the damn steps and everything. So it's a beautiful story. And even though there were a lot of loss, a lot of pain, and a lot of tea and scandals that evolved, within this group, they have a legend that cannot be denied, and they will always be a pinnacle in black music. So that's what I have, everybody. Get down in those comments. Let me know what you think of this. Episode, and what are your favorite, songs from the Temptations. And I definitely just want to hear your thoughts. I definitely love hearing you guys. I love you, and I thank you for all your love and support. So that's what I have, everybody. So subscribe to my channel. Click that bell so you get notifications every time I drop a video. Also, follow me on all of my social platforms that are listed in the description box. Also, like this video, comment on this video, and share this video. And I will be back with another episode of Tea and Scandals. So until next time, everybody, take care.